In tonight's episode, we're diving into two of the most chilling ghost stories Asia has ever given the world. Tales of betrayal, vengeance, and spirits that refuse to rest. And the first one takes us straight into the backstreets of Edo-period Tokyo, where one of Japan's most famous ghosts was born. Her name still makes people uneasy, even 2 centuries later. Because once you hear her story, you'll understand why shrines still stand in her memory, and why actors even today whisper prayers before speaking her name on stage. This is the story of Oiwa. On the surface, she was a devoted wife, loyal to a man who swore to protect her. But beneath the fragile walls of their home, a darker plan was already unfolding. Her husband, a ronin named Iemon, had grown tired of her and hungered for power and wealth. For him, Oiwa was no longer a partner, she was an obstacle. And in a world built on ambition and betrayal, obstacles were meant to be removed. The way he chose to remove her would change Japanese folklore forever. Poison. Slow. Cruel. The kind of poison that didn't just end life, but tore dignity away, piece by piece. And as her body broke, her spirit prepared to rise. Tokyo in the early 19th century was a place of shadows and whispers. The city pulsed with life, lanterns glowing in narrow alleys, kabuki theaters roaring with stories of warriors and lovers, merchants calling out over the din of crowded markets. But behind the noise and color, behind the endless movement of a city that never seemed to sleep, there were homes where secrets lived, homes where darkness gathered in silence. One of those homes belonged to a woman named Oiwa. Oiwa was no noble lady. She wasn't born into fortune, nor did she carry the power of a wealthy family name. She was the wife of a ronin, a masterless samurai named Iemon, who struggled to find his place in a society that valued rank and standing above all else. For Oiwa, her life was built on quiet loyalty. She endured hardship with the kind of patience that only deep love can create. She cooked, she cleaned, she comforted. She believed that no matter how difficult their days might be, they could face them together. But for Iemon, loyalty was never enough. Ambition gnawed at him, restless and hungry. He wanted more than Oiwa could give: status, security, the kind of life only marriage into a wealthier family could provide. To him, Oiwa had become less a wife and more a chain dragging him down. And in the cramped, flickering light of their home, that resentment began to rot into something dangerous. Their house itself was unremarkable, one of many wooden dwellings scattered along the edges of Edo. But those who passed by sometimes claimed they could feel an odd heaviness in the air, as though the very beams of the house knew what was coming. Inside, the walls carried every whisper, every argument, every lie left unsaid. By day it was quiet, filled with the faint smoke of cooking fires and the sound of neighbors' footsteps echoing through thin partitions. But by night, shadows crept longer, the oil lamp trembling against paper screens, and silence thickened like water in the lungs. This was the setting of Oiwa's downfall, a world that looked ordinary, but where one act of betrayal would open a door that could never be closed again. What Oiwa never realized, at least not in time, was that she had already been marked. Iemon's desire for another woman, the daughter of a wealthy family, had pushed him into a decision he could never undo. And once he made it, Oiwa's fate was sealed not in battle, not by the hand of an enemy, but in the place she thought safest, her own home. The tragedy of Oiwa's story is not just what happened to her body, but where it happened. The intimacy of it. Poison delivered in her meals, a slow invasion disguised as care. The very food she trusted, the very act of sharing a table with her husband, became the instrument of her destruction. Every bite carrying the taste of love turned sour, every swallow drawing her closer to the edge. At first, the change was subtle, a sense of weariness she couldn't shake, strange aches that clung to her bones. But then the mirror began to show her what others already saw. Skin paling, hair loosening in ugly clumps, an eye slipping downward as though pulled by some invisible weight. It was as though her own reflection betrayed her, revealing the monster her husband had made of her. And yet, even as her body crumbled, her spirit began to harden, because deep within the walls of that narrow Edo home, something more terrifying than death was being born. Oiwa's suffering was not the end. It was only the beginning of a haunting that would outlast them all. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the air in Oiwa's home had shifted just slightly, carrying with it a heaviness that could not be explained. Her illness had already taken hold, her body bearing the marks of poison with each passing day, but there was something else creeping into the fabric of her existence, something neither she nor her neighbors could name, though they all felt it. The first complication was not the disfigurement itself, that had been clear enough in her reflection, a cruel revelation of what the poison was doing. No. The complication lay in the way the world around her began to respond. Whispers spread beyond the thin walls, reaching the ears of neighbors and passers-by. Some avoided her street altogether, muttering that Oiwa had been touched by something unclean, as if illness alone could explain the strange aura that now hung over her household. Others claimed they had seen shadows flicker unnaturally behind her screens, even when no lamp had been lit. A few swore they had heard her weeping through the night, though when asked, Oiwa insisted she had been silent. Inside the home, the strangeness became more personal. Lanterns sputtered and died whenever she sat too close. Oil that should have burned for hours extinguished within minutes, leaving her in oppressive darkness. At first, she thought it was coincidence, the natural failure of simple tools, but the pattern grew undeniable. Light could not seem to stay near her. The only constant was the mirror, where her own twisted reflection never faltered, a cruel permanence that mocked her attempts to find comfort in the ordinary. Iemon, the very man who had orchestrated her suffering, began to exhibit his own unease. His cruelty had been deliberate, his betrayal calculated, yet even he could not deny that the atmosphere of their home had shifted into something unnatural. He avoided her gaze, and when forced to look, his eyes darted away as though he feared that what he saw in her face might leap from flesh to spirit. One evening, as he passed her chamber, he swore he heard her whisper his name, in a voice that did not belong to her. It was deeper, colder, and seemed to seep through the wood itself. When he confronted her, she looked up in confusion. She had spoken nothing. The poison had accomplished what he intended. Oiwa's body was failing, her beauty gone, her health irreparably broken. Yet the consequence was not what he anticipated. Instead of freeing him, her decline seemed to bind him to something far worse. He began to dream of her standing over him, her one drooping eye glowing faintly in the dark, her hair hanging in long, ragged strands. The dreams left him gasping awake, only to find his room filled with the faint scent of rotting flowers. Neighbors began to speak more openly. One woman who lived nearby insisted she had seen Oiwa's face in her own water basin, while drawing from the well, her features warped and pale beneath the surface before dissolving into ripples. A merchant passing by their home claimed he saw Oiwa's silhouette framed in the window, but when he looked again, there was nothing, only the empty sway of a torn paper screen. These small accounts carried no proof, but together they wove an atmosphere of suspicion that Iemon could not control. And for Oiwa, trapped in her own unraveling body, these occurrences stirred a question she had not yet dared to voice. Was it only poison destroying her, or was something else awakening within her suffering? The mirror did not lie, but neither did the fear she began to inspire in those who once pitied her. Children were pulled away when she appeared outside. Men averted their eyes. It was as though the city itself had decided she no longer belonged among the living. The first complication, then, was not death itself, but the realization that she had already begun to cross a boundary no one could name. A shift between illness and haunting, between victim and something far more enduring. Each extinguished lamp, each whispered rumor, each dream that Iemon could not explain, all of it suggested a truth forming in the shadows. Something was beginning that could not be stopped, and though the danger was not yet fully revealed, its presence was undeniable. The sickness had twisted Oiwa's body beyond recognition, but what came next unsettled even those who had hardened themselves against pity. What began as flickering shadows and extinguished lamps grew into something far more sinister, escalating night by night until the household itself felt like a living trap. It started with the mirror. One evening, as Oiwa struggled to comb what remained of her thinning hair, she saw not herself but a grotesque parody staring back. Her eye drooped farther than it should, her jaw hanging slack in a way her body had not yet succumbed to. The reflection moved differently from her own motions, lagging a second behind, as if mocking her. She screamed, shattering the stillness of the night, but when Iemon rushed in, the mirror showed only her fragile form, trembling on the floor. He dismissed her cries as weakness, though the unease in his voice betrayed him. The next layer of strangeness emerged from within the home itself. A servant, hired to help tend to Oiwa in her declining state, began to behave oddly. At first she was dutiful, offering water and cleaning quietly. But after a week, she grew pale, her hands trembling whenever she entered Oiwa's chamber. She whispered prayers under her breath, eyes darting to corners where nothing visible stood. Finally, one morning, she fled the house altogether, muttering that the walls whispered Oiwa's name even when the woman lay silent. Iemon cursed her for cowardice, but inside, her words dug into his mind. Tension deepened when another figure entered the story, the wealthy family whose daughter Iemon sought to marry. They had heard whispers of Oiwa's failing health, and the prospect of her passing away naturally began to surface in careful, veiled conversations. They did not question too deeply why her decline had been so sudden, but they offered Iemon subtle encouragement, an implicit push toward removing his burden completely. One relative, emboldened by ambition, even suggested that lingering spirits must be appeased if Oiwa were to die without trouble. The comment was framed as superstition, yet it left Iemon shaken, for it mirrored his own gnawing fears. By now, Oiwa's suffering had turned into something both pitiful and terrifying. Her skin grew blotched, her hair hung in patches, and her voice wavered between fragile sobs and sudden, guttural tones that seemed to come from elsewhere. The neighbors spoke of her as though she were already gone, and yet she lingered, her presence stretching beyond her body, seeping into dreams, into whispers, into the flicker of lanterns. Then came the warning. Late one night, as Iemon walked home through the narrow alleys of Edo, an old woman stopped him. She was a stranger, her back hunched, her eyes sharp beneath a tangle of grey hair. Without preamble, she told him that a spirit wronged by betrayal never rests. That when a woman dies with rage in her heart, no shrine, no prayer, no wealth can shield the one who caused her pain. She leaned close, her breath sour with age, and whispered, "Your wife will not forgive you, not in this life, not in the next." Iemon staggered back, demanding to know who she was, but the woman was already gone, swallowed by the night. He convinced himself it was madness, a chance encounter twisted by guilt, but the words clung to him like smoke. Back in the house, Oiwa's decline accelerated, and with it, the disturbances. Neighbors heard furniture dragging across floors when no one was inside. A lantern lit itself in the dead of night, glowing red as blood before burning out. One visitor swore he saw Oiwa's face pressed against the paper screen from the outside, though she had not left her futon in days. The series of tensions stacked relentlessly, weaving a suffocating net around Iemon. The woman he poisoned was no longer just his victim. She was becoming something else, something that would not remain confined to her ruined body. And though danger had not yet erupted fully, its promise hung heavy in the air, undeniable and inescapable. The night it all reached its breaking point began without warning. The cicadas droned in the summer heat. The lanterns in the alleys outside swayed against the breath of a distant storm, and Oiwa lay in her futon, her body nearly unrecognizable. Her skin had turned a sickly yellow, her hair fell out in handfuls, and one eye drooped so low it seemed ready to slide from her skull. She was breathing, but each shallow inhale sounded less like life and more like the rattling of a spirit clawing its way free. Iemon had grown restless. The guilt he refused to name gnawed at him like teeth in the dark. He told himself this was the path to freedom, the sacrifice required to secure wealth and status. Soon, Oiwa would die, and he would finally be rid of her. Yet, no matter how many times he repeated it, the house itself seemed to disagree. That night, the mirror spoke again. Iemon walked past it, barely glancing at the warped piece of glass. But from the corner of his eye, he saw her reflection rise from the futon before her body did. He froze, staring as the image of Oiwa slowly stood upright in the mirror, her face grotesquely swollen, her hair a matted curtain of black. Her reflection smiled at him, an awful, lopsided smile that her real mouth never made. Iemon spun around to look at her on the futon. She had not moved. Her eyes were closed, her breaths faint. Yet in the mirror, she was alive, watching him. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. For a moment, he considered shattering the mirror, but something in him, fear, fascination, a recognition that it would not help, held him still. He covered it with cloth instead, muttering to himself as if words could push away the image burned into his mind. That was when the lamp began to flicker. The servant who had once fled in fear had left a lantern in the corner of the room, its flame steady. But now it hissed, bending low as though a breath had blown against it, before flaring high with unnatural color. The flame burned blue, then green, then finally red, casting the walls in a bloody glow. And within that light, the paper screen began to ripple. A handprint appeared from the other side, pressing through as though something unseen was trying to claw its way in. Iemon rushed to the screen, yanking it open, but there was nothing, only the empty corridor, silent and still. When he turned back, Oiwa was staring at him. Her drooping eye glistened, her lips twisted into a faint grimace. Iemon, her voice was thin, broken, but there was weight in it. He told himself she was delirious, that she didn't know what she was saying. Yet, when she spoke again, the tone shifted. Deeper, colder. You did this. The words cut through him like a blade. He dropped to his knees, muttering excuses, lies, anything to break the moment. But her expression did not change. She lifted one trembling hand, pointing toward the mirror he had covered. The cloth began to darken, as if soaked with blood, spreading in jagged shapes that dripped without dripping, staining without wetting the floor. Then came the sound, the dragging of something heavy across wood, echoing through the house, though no one else was there. It started in the far room and moved closer, scraping, halting, scraping again, until it seemed to stop just behind him. He didn't dare turn. And then, the lantern burst. The glass cracked, flames shot upward, and for an instant, Oiwa's face filled the entire room. Not her real face, but the twisted, spectral mask of it. Hair falling in tangled clumps, her eye bulging, her jaw slack, her skin hanging like melted wax. She was everywhere, on every wall, her mouth opening and closing in a soundless scream that still thundered in his ears. Iemon cried out, stumbling backward. He clawed at the door, flinging it open to escape the suffocating vision, but even outside, he was not free. The neighbors' houses stood dark and silent, yet every shadow stretched into her shape. In the well, he saw her face floating in the water. In the lanterns lining the street, her drooping eye blinked back at him. Even in his own hands, when he looked down in panic, her twisted features rippled across his skin as though his flesh was no longer his own. "What is happening?" he gasped, the question spilling out of him not as curiosity but as raw terror. But no answer came, only the echo of her voice, layered and distorted, filling the night. "Iemon, you will never be free." In that moment, the line between hallucination and haunting shattered. He no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming, alive or already trapped in her vengeful world. Every step forward only brought her closer. Every breath he took seemed borrowed from her fury. And for the first time, Iemon understood that death would not end her suffering. It would only unleash it fully. This was no longer poison, no longer betrayal. This was something far greater, a spirit rising, unstoppable, and waiting to claim him. The storm that had been brewing in silence finally broke, not with thunder or rain, but with the quiet unraveling of truth. For days, Iemon staggered through the city like a man cursed, shadows clinging to him wherever he went. He avoided the house, but no matter how far he wandered, Oiwa followed. Her face appeared in rippling puddles, in the gleam of polished steel, even in the flame of candles that should have offered warmth. Every glance was a reminder of what he had done, and every whisper in the wind seemed to repeat the same word: betrayal. But it was not until he returned to the kabuki theater that the pieces began to fall into place. Kabuki troupes were already whispering her name, spinning her suffering into plays long before her body had grown cold. When Iemon overheard one such rehearsal, he froze. The actors spoke lines that were not supposed to exist, details of Oiwa's torment that no one outside their home should have known. Her poisoned meals, her crumbling hair, her eyes sliding down her face. These were truths she had suffered in silence. Yet, here they were, brought to life on stage. And then the strangest part, before performing, the actors bowed their heads, lighting incense and whispering prayers into the empty air. "For Oiwa," they murmured, "that her spirit does not follow us from this stage." Iemon felt his blood run cold. He had thought her haunting was his private curse, punishment for his cruelty. But this meant something else. Oiwa's rage had not only tethered itself to him, it had seeped into the fabric of the city, her suffering immortalized through every retelling. The theater was not a playhouse anymore. It was an altar. And there, in the dim glow of candles, came the revelation. An older actor, his face painted white, paused to explain to the younger cast why such prayers were necessary. "A betrayed woman's spirit does not rest," he said gravely. "When her dignity is stolen, when her death is laced with cruelty, she lingers. Not only to torment the one who wronged her, but to remind us all of what betrayal creates. She becomes onryo, vengeful ghost. Her fury does not fade, it spreads." The word struck Iemon like a blade, onryo. He had heard it before, tales of spirits twisted by betrayal, but he had never believed them. Now he realized he was living one. Oiwa had not merely cursed him. She had become something larger, something eternal. Her pain had carved itself into the world. This truth reframed everything that had come before. The extinguished lanterns were not coincidences. The whispers neighbors heard through the walls were not imagination. The distorted reflection in the mirror was not madness. They were the earliest signs of her transformation, the moment her suffering bled into spirit. Every step he had taken to rid himself of her had only fed the haunting, given her rage fuel to grow. Poison had killed her body, but betrayal had birthed her ghost. The final piece of the revelation came not from actors, nor from neighbors, but from Oiwa herself. That night, when Iemon returned home, he found her futon empty. For a brief, fleeting moment, he thought she had finally died, but then he saw her face staring back at him from the lantern flame. Her lips parted, and though her voice was faint, it carried with it the weight of inevitability. "You thought you ended me, but you created me." The words struck like thunder. He had imagined death as release, the moment his burden would dissolve into the earth. Instead, he realized death was only the beginning. Her body had been fragile, but her spirit was indestructible, forged from betrayal and humiliation. In killing her, he had ensured that she would never leave him. And perhaps most terrifying of all, her reach was no longer bound to him alone. If the actors prayed to her, if neighbors saw her face in water and flame, then Oiwa's curse was already larger than one man's sin. She had become legend, a warning, a force that would echo far beyond the walls of their house. Iemon crumpled beneath the weight of it, clawing at his own face as if he could tear away her image imprinted on his mind. But nothing worked. She lingered in every breath, every sound, every silence. The revelation was clear, undeniable, and final. Oiwa was no longer his wife. She was no longer human at all. She was onryo, vengeful ghost. And nothing, no prayer, no ritual, no distance would ever set him free. From that night on, Iemon could no longer separate the living world from the dead. By day, he walked among people, but every glance, every reflection, carried Oiwa's twisted face. By night, he dreamed of her body rising from the futon, her disfigured eye glowing faintly in the dark, her voice hissing his name until he woke drenched in sweat. The revelation had shattered him. There would be no release, no end, only the certainty that she would follow him into every breath of his life. But Oiwa was not finished. One evening, as Iemon stumbled through the narrow alleys of Edo, he saw her again, not in mirrors or lanterns, but standing at the far end of the street. Her form wavered, half shadow, half flesh, her hair falling in clumps against her pale face. She did not move toward him, she only waited, watching. When he blinked, she was gone. Yet the echo of her gaze stayed with him, heavier than any blade. Neighbors later whispered that he had begun to speak to walls, to argue with shadows. Some claimed they saw him strike at empty air, screaming Oiwa's name as if she stood before him. Others said they heard him begging for forgiveness, only to collapse in silence moments later. None could say what was real and what was madness. And then, one morning, Iemon himself vanished. His home stood empty, his possessions scattered, his futon overturned as though in a struggle. No one saw him leave. No one saw where he went. All that remained was the mirror, cracked down the middle, its fractured surface reflecting Oiwa's broken smile. Even today, shrines in Tokyo's Yotsuya district honor her name. Actors light incense before performing her story, terrified that without it, her ghost will follow them home. And so the question lingers. Was Oiwa's vengeance ever complete? Or is she still searching, waiting in shadows for the next voice careless enough to speak her name? Because legends never die, and betrayal always leaves something behind. The tale of Oiwa shows how betrayal can twist love into eternal vengeance, binding a spirit to the living long after the body is gone. But Japan is not the only place where injustice gave birth to restless ghosts. Across the sea in Korea, another story unfolded. One not of a single woman betrayed by her husband, but of two sisters destroyed by envy and cruelty. Where Oiwa's haunting was fueled by poison and lies, theirs was born from a stepmother's jealousy and a pond that became their grave. Both legends ask the same chilling question: what happens when innocence is buried but the truth refuses to stay hidden? Tonight, the second story takes us to the Joseon dynasty, to the dark waters where the spirits of Jangwa and Onryo still cry for justice. Joseon-era Korea was a land of strict rules and rigid hierarchy, a society where appearances mattered as much as truth, and where women were expected to embody purity, obedience, and silence. In a quiet village on the edge of a wooded valley, two sisters lived beneath the shadow of a home that should have protected them but instead became their prison. Their names carried beauty in their meaning: Janghwa, the rose, and onryo, the red lotus. They were said to be gentle in nature, graceful in manner, and beloved by their father. Yet beauty and goodness alone could not shield them from the malice that grew inside their household walls. After their mother's death, their father remarried, and with the new wife came a storm of envy. The stepmother saw in the sisters not daughters, but rivals. Their elegance and innocence were reminders of her own bitterness, and her jealousy grew like a creeping vine, curling tighter with each passing day. She wanted her own children to inherit not just the household, but also the favor, the name, and the standing that Janghwa and onryo carried. To achieve that, she needed the sisters ruined. The setting of their tragedy was deceptively ordinary. A small home tucked near a pond that villagers claimed was bottomless. Its still surface mirrored the sky by day and swallowed moonlight by night, a perfect circle of silence surrounded by reeds and whispering willows. To most, it was just a pond. To the sisters, it was the backdrop of their last breaths. The kind of place where shadows lingered too long and silence pressed against the skin like water waiting to pull you under. At first, life continued with a fragile semblance of normalcy. The sisters performed their daily tasks, fetching water, sewing by lamplight, bowing before their father with dutiful respect. But beneath the surface, the stepmother's schemes began to take form. She planted whispers of impurity, carefully chosen lies designed to blacken their reputation. In a world where a woman's virtue defined her worth, these accusations were as deadly as any blade. Janghwa, the elder, became the first target. The stepmother staged false evidence, twisting innocence into guilt until the village began to murmur. What once was admiration turned to suspicion. The sisters themselves sensed the change before they understood its cause. Neighbors who once greeted them now averted their eyes. A friend's voice turned hesitant, uncertain. And within their own home, the atmosphere thickened. The stepmother's smile was sharp, her words dripping with false sweetness that barely concealed her venom. At night, the sisters whispered to each other in their shared chamber, their voices trembling as they tried to make sense of the shadows closing in around them. The goal of the sisters was simple: survival, dignity, and the chance to live quiet lives unmarred by scandal. But innocence offers little protection against envy, sharpened into cruelty. As the accusations mounted, Janghwa found herself isolated, her father deceived by the lies, her reputation crumbling under the weight of fabrications. And just beyond the walls of their home, the pond waited, silent and black, as though it already knew what role it would play in their story. What made their situation so terrifying was not a sudden act of violence, but the slow, deliberate suffocation of their world. A stepmother who smiled in the daylight and whispered poison in the dark. A community eager to believe scandal over truth. And two sisters, clinging to each other in the midst of it all, unaware that their names would one day echo not for the lives they lived, but for the way they were silenced. The stage was set. The rose and the red lotus had been marked, and the waters of the pond would soon claim them. But in Korea, as in Japan, innocence wronged does not rest quietly. And the shadows around their home were already stirring. It began with whispers, soft at first, drifting like smoke through the village. Janghwa, the elder sister, felt their sting long before she understood their origin. Women at the well would turn away when she approached, their buckets clattering in a hurry to leave. Children, who once giggled at her kind words, now pulled back to their mother's skirts. Even the old men, usually quick with blessings, muttered only silence as she passed. At home, the air grew heavier. The stepmother's voice, once sly and cutting, now dripped with false pity. She would sigh loudly at the dinner table, shaking her head at Jungwa's every move, casting subtle glances toward their father until he, too, began to frown. It wasn't long before the stepmother made her first move. She slipped a bloodied cloth beneath Jungwa's bedding and then discovered it in front of the household, crying that the girl's honor had been stained. In a society where purity was everything, this was no small accusation. It was social death. But the strange part wasn't just the accusation. It was the way the house itself seemed to react afterward. That night, as Jungwa lay restless, she swore she heard faint splashes from the pond beyond the walls. It was as though someone, or something, was pacing along its edges, dipping into the water with steady rhythm. She pressed her ear to the floor, but the sound carried everywhere, impossible to locate. When she asked Hongryan if she heard it too, her younger sister nodded, eyes wide with fear. They whispered until dawn, trying to convince themselves it was only frogs or fishermen, but in their hearts they knew it was neither. The first complication had arrived, not in the form of open violence, but in this eerie overlapping of lies and strange occurrences. By day, their reputations unraveled. By night, the pond seemed to breathe. Soon after, other unsettling things began to happen. Jungwa's reflection in the water became distorted, even when the surface lay perfectly still. She leaned over once to fetch water, and her own face rippled back at her, eyes hollow and lips pale, as if the pond was showing her not who she was, but what she would become. Hongryan pulled her back, insisting she stay away, but the image lingered in Jungwa's mind. The villagers too noticed oddities. Some claimed to hear weeping by the pond at dusk, soft and desperate, though no one was ever seen there. Others swore that reeds swayed violently without wind, as if unseen hands pushed through them. The stepmother dismissed these stories with mocking laughter, but her eyes betrayed unease whenever the pond was mentioned. For Jungwa, the complication grew into a question that gnawed at her more than the stepmother's cruelty. Why did the pond seem to know her sorrow? Why did it echo her fears at night, replaying them in water and sound? It was as though the lies being spun around her had stirred something deeper, something waiting for her beneath the surface. Even within the house, the atmosphere thickened. Their father, confused and weary, began to withdraw, trusting the stepmother's poisonous words over his daughter's innocence. Jungwa felt her grip on safety slipping. Her goal had once been to preserve dignity, to prove her innocence, but now her goal seemed to shrink to something simpler: survival. The sisters whispered to one another more often, clinging to each other in the dim glow of the oil lamp. They tried to ignore the strange sounds from the pond, the distorted reflections, the neighbors' sidelong glances. But the truth was clear. Something had shifted. The lies that framed Jungwa were not just tearing apart her life. They were waking something in the shadows. And the sisters could not shake the feeling that the pond was waiting for one of them to come closer, waiting to claim what the stepmother had already marked as doomed. The tension in the household grew thicker with each passing day, as though the walls themselves absorbed the malice and exhaled it back at the sisters. The whispers of impurity had already stained Jungwa's name, but the stepmother wasn't finished. She wanted not just their disgrace, but their erasure. And so the lies grew darker, sharper, impossible to defend against. The second strange event came during a family gathering. The stepmother arranged for distant relatives to visit, an opportunity to parade her daughters as proper and virtuous while exposing Jungwa to ridicule. Over dinner, she feigned shock when a small bundle was discovered hidden among Jungwa's things, an infant's cloth, soiled and marked, meant to suggest that she had borne a child in secret. Gasps rippled through the room. Their father's face hardened, his silence cutting deeper than words. Junghwa could only tremble, unable to defend herself against something she had never seen before that moment. But it was what happened afterward that unsettled everyone. As the relatives whispered and the stepmother feigned tears, the oil lamp sputtered violently, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The flame rose high, green for a heartbeat, before nearly going out. Several guests cried out, clutching at their sleeves as the room fell into a suffocating darkness. When the flame finally steadied, it was weak and pale, as though the light itself had been drained. Silence lingered far too long, broken only by the sound of distant splashing outside, the pond restless once again. It was then that a new character stepped into the story, the village shaman. She had heard the rumors of impurity, but more than that, she had heard the villagers speak of strange sounds by the water. She visited the family under the guise of offering blessings, but her eyes lingered on the sisters with a peculiar intensity. After the ritual, she pulled Hongryan aside, her voice low and urgent. "Your house is heavy with injustice," she whispered. "The pond waits for truth. Beware the lies, for they will drown more than your name." The warning only deepened the dread that had been gnawing at them. Hongryan repeated the words to her sister that night, and both lay awake listening to the faint sound of water lapping against the reeds. The stepmother, however, dismissed the shaman as a meddler, forbidding the sisters to speak of her again. Yet the shaman's words clung to them, heavy and unshakable. The stepmother escalated her cruelty, emboldened by the silence of the father and the fear of the sisters. She began to taunt Junghwa directly, mocking her with sly smiles and questions that cut deeper than knives. "What will people say when they know the truth?" she sneered. "Will the pond keep your secrets, or will it show them all?" And the pond seemed to answer. Its surface, once still and calm, now rippled on windless nights. The reeds bent without cause, and villagers swore they saw pale figures moving near the water's edge. One farmer claimed that while passing at dawn, he saw two women kneeling at the bank, weeping into their hands. When he approached, they vanished, leaving only the faint rings of disturbed water. The sisters grew more isolated. Even Hongryan, once shielded by her youth, began to feel the weight of suspicion. Neighbors watched her closely, their eyes sharp with judgment, their voices low but pointed. The stepmother's plan was working. Every lie she planted found eager soil, and every strange occurrence seemed to confirm her story. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred. The sisters began to sense that the pond itself was more than a silent witness. It was listening, waiting. The shaman's warning echoed in their minds, and with each passing night, the splashing grew louder, the weeping clearer. The escalation was no longer only about lies and cruelty. It was about the creeping certainty that the pond would not remain passive, that it was preparing to answer in its own way, in its own time. And when it did, the stepmother's schemes, the father's silence, and the sister's suffering would all be dragged into its depths. The night of the breaking point arrived with a stillness that was wrong, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin and made even the crickets hold their breath. The sisters had grown used to the cruelty of their stepmother, to the poisonous whispers and false accusations, but on this night the air itself felt hostile. The pond, barely visible through the trees, gleamed with a strange sheen under the moonlight, its surface rippling though no wind stirred. It was as if the water itself was waiting, expectant, hungry. Junghwa had been accused again, this time in front of their father with such convincing evidence that he turned his face from her, unable or unwilling to defend his daughter. The stepmother's words rang in the silence. "She is unclean. She has shamed this household. She must be cast out." And though Junghwa pleaded, though Hongryan clung to her hand, the father said nothing. His silence was a verdict sharper than any blade. That night, Junghwa could not sleep. She sat by the paper screen, staring at the faint glow of the pond in the distance. And then she heard it. At first, the familiar splashing, soft and rhythmic. But this time, it was louder, closer, as though footsteps walked directly across the water. She pressed herself against the wooden frame, heart pounding, and listened. A voice rose with the sound, not clear words, but sobs, low and ragged, like a woman weeping just outside. She woke onryo, who sat upright instantly, eyes wide. "You hear it too?" the younger sister whispered. Together they crouched by the door, listening. The sobs grew louder, mixed with faint whispers that seemed to echo their own names. Jangwa, onryo. The voices carried not from outside, but from beneath them, seeping up through the wooden floorboards, as if the pond itself had moved into the house. Terrified, onryo grabbed her sister's arm, insisting they wake their father, but before they could move, the paper screen rippled. Not the frame, not the wood, only the paper, as though a hand pressed from the other side. The shape of slender fingers spread across the thin surface, dragging downward slowly, leaving no tear, no stain, only the undeniable imprint of something that was not there. Both sisters screamed, but their voices seemed swallowed by the house itself. No one came. Moments later, the lantern in their chamber burst into violent light. The flame rose tall and twisted, turning from gold to blue to a deep, unnatural red that bathed the room in a sickly glow. In its light, the sisters saw reflections not of themselves but of pale faces, weeping water, hair plastered against cheeks, eyes rolled white. The images flickered across the walls as if dozens of unseen women stood inside the room with them, sobbing in unison. "What is happening?" onryo whispered, clinging to her sister. But Jangwa could not answer. Her own voice had caught in her throat. Then came the sound of dragging, a slow scrape across the floorboards just beyond the door. The sisters froze as it grew louder, closer, until it stopped at the threshold. The paper screen quivered once, twice, and then fell utterly still. The silence returned, thicker than before. Unable to bear it, Jangwa slid the screen open. The corridor outside was empty, dark, but damp footprints marked the wood, leading toward the pond. With trembling hands, she held her sister back, whispering for her not to follow, but her own body moved as though compelled. Step by step, she trailed the footprints through the silent house, past the chamber where their father lay sleeping, or pretending to, and out into the cold night. At the edge of the pond, the footprints vanished into the water. The surface rippled, though no stone had been thrown. And then, from the center of the pond, bubbles rose. Slowly, steadily, until they broke into a churning froth. Something pale emerged, a hand, delicate and dripping, reaching upward before sinking again into the black. Jangwa staggered back, her breath caught between a scream and a sob. onryo clung to her, both sisters staring as the pond stilled once more, reflecting only the moon. But in that reflection, they saw themselves not as they were, but drowned, faces pale, lips blue, hair floating around them like shrouds. "What is going on?" onryo cried, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the pond's silence, as though it had already chosen what would happen next. In that moment, the sisters understood that the accusations, the lies, the cruelty of their stepmother, those were only the surface. Something deeper had been stirred, something that demanded more than tears. The pond was no longer a place of water. It was a mouth waiting to consume, a mirror showing not just what was, but what was about to be. And as the sisters stood frozen by its edge, they realized they were not simply victims of slander. They had become part of a haunting already in motion, and the pond would not rest until it had taken what it was promised. The days after that night unfolded in a blur of fear and silence. The sisters moved through their home like ghosts already, their eyes sunken from sleeplessness, their hands trembling with the memory of the pond's reflection. The stepmother's cruelty did not waver. If anything, she grew bolder, sensing that her prey had been weakened beyond resistance. Yet beneath her sharp words and feigned innocence, even she could not ignore the way the household had changed. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper, and every night the pond seemed louder, as though water could speak. Then came the revelation, not from the sisters, but from the magistrate newly appointed to their district. He arrived one morning, greeted with formality by the villagers, who whispered of his youth, his sharp eyes, and his refusal to be swayed by gossip. Within days, he heard the story of Janghwa's supposed impurity and the dishonor that clung to both sisters. But he also heard the other rumors, the ones villagers spoke of only in hushed tones. That, at night, weeping carried from the pond, that travelers passing by saw pale figures kneeling at its edge, that one magistrate after another had fallen ill or died, mysteriously after refusing to look deeper into the story of the sisters. Unlike those before him, this magistrate listened. He began to investigate, questioning not only the father and stepmother, but also neighbors, servants, anyone who had seen or heard strange things. And as the pieces came together, the truth revealed itself with terrible clarity. The stepmother's accusations were not misfortune or suspicion. They were lies, carefully planted to destroy the sister's reputation and elevate her own children. She had staged the evidence, twisted the father's silence into complicity, and left the girls defenseless in a society eager to believe scandal. But the haunting of the pond was not mere rumor. It was testimony. The spirits of Janghwa and Hongrian had not remained silent in death. They had woven their pain into the land, forcing the truth into the open where human voices had failed them. Every splash in the night, every distorted reflection, every sob echoing across the water, these were not random horrors, but cries for justice. The magistrate, shaken but resolute, returned to the pond to see for himself. Standing at its edge, he lit a lantern and bowed low, asking aloud what had truly happened. The water rippled, though no wind stirred, and a faint cry rose from the depths, two voices overlapping, soft but unmistakable. Father, innocent, wronged. The words broke apart in sobs, but the meaning was undeniable. The sisters had been murdered. And with that revelation, the past reframed itself. The accusations of impurity, the staged evidence, the spreading lies, all of it was a noose pulled tighter by a jealous hand. The pond's restless surface was not just haunting, but testimony from beyond death. The stepmother had not only destroyed 2 lives, she had unleashed a curse that no lie could bury. When the magistrate confronted the father, demanding the truth, the man wept. He admitted he had believed the stepmother's words, too weak to question her deceit, too bound by the fear of scandal to defend his daughters. His silence had condemned them as surely as the stepmother's hands. In that moment, the sisters' tragedy stood in stark relief. They had not been destroyed by fate or illness, but by human cruelty, sharpened by envy and silence. The magistrate ordered the stepmother punished, her lies laid bare for all to see. And though justice came too late to save Janghwa and Hongrian, it came swiftly enough to reveal the truth they had cried for in death. The haunting had not been madness or illusion. It was their voices, demanding to be heard. For the sisters, peace finally edged into the story. The pond, once restless and cruel, grew still. The cries at night softened, then faded. But the memory of those sounds remained etched in the minds of villagers who knew they had walked alongside a haunting born not from superstition, but from injustice too terrible to be silenced. And so the revelation reshaped everything. The strange events were not random horrors, but signs, clues pointing to the truth. The sisters had not been impure, they had been innocent. And in their innocence, wronged so deeply, they had become spirits powerful enough to bend the living toward confession. Their story would not be forgotten, for it was proof that even the grave could not hold back justice forever. When the truth was finally spoken aloud, it seemed as though the entire village exhaled. The stepmother's deceit was exposed, her cruelty punished, and the magistrate declared the innocence of Jangwa and Onryo. Justice, at last, had been served. Yet, even as the villagers nodded, whispering that peace had been restored, a chill lingered in the air, as though the pond itself had not yet closed its story. For a time the waters stilled. The midnight weeping ceased. No more pale figures appeared along the banks. But the silence was not comforting. It was heavy, watchful, as if the pond was only sleeping. Villagers avoided its edge after dusk, unwilling to test whether the sisters had truly departed or were only waiting beneath the surface. Years later, travelers spoke of strange happenings again. A lantern flickering red as someone passed too close. A reflection that showed two girls where only one stood. Some claimed to hear their names. Jangwa, Onryo, carried faintly on the wind. Perhaps it was imagination. Or perhaps spirits do not surrender so easily, even when justice is done. The magistrate himself was never the same. He left the village soon after, refusing to explain why he never returned to the pond, though his nights were said to be haunted by dreams of two girls weeping beside his bed. And so the story ends, but not neatly. Were the sisters finally at rest, or did they leave behind a warning? That even when truth rises and justice is served, the scars of betrayal echo far longer than any verdict. Today, Koreans still tell the tale of the rose and the red lotus. Some bow their heads when speaking their names, others glance nervously toward dark water. Because if grief that deep can stir the dead to speak, then who's to say it cannot stir them again? I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you liked them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.